Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my MSI main stage day 1 and day 2 overview and analysis video. We're back. I know that some of you probably were a bit sad that there wasn't a video yesterday. I wanted to cover MSI daily, but as you guys know, I did have to have some surprise surgery over the weekend. I got the video on Monday out as quickly as I possibly could, but just didn't feel like it was a good idea to go and make another one the day after, so I let that one slide. So today we're going to be covering both day 1 and day 2. Hopefully it's going to be daily from here on out. I'm on the upswing in terms of recovery. It shouldn't be all that difficult for me to record for the rest of the week and, for the rest of the month as MSI is going on, so hopefully that continues to go well, but I'm excited for today's action. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you think was going to happen in the two series that we got to kick off the main stage? Of course, we have a couple of teams that made it out of the play-in stage to talk about here today, but a couple of teams we're seeing for the first time here at MSI, the number 1 seed from North America, and of course, the number 1 seed from the LCK as well. So a lot of fun action. If you want to know my thoughts on everything that happened in the play-ins and what I expected to happen in the main stage, you can check out the playlist up in the iCard. Not only is that going to have every single day of play-ins covered, as I have covered every single game at this tournament so far, but it's also going to be my primer video, which is going to have all of that information, all of the power rankings for all of these teams that are in the main stage as well, so you can kind of get some ideas as to where I think these teams are going to go. But today is going to be spent mostly talking about the first 2 days, the first 2 series that we got, the first 2 best of 5s at MSI, so I'm very, very excited. If you are new here, what we do on this channel is we're going to go game by game in each series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I will be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of each series, I'll be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will very quickly be previewing day number 3 at the end of this video. Also want to point out, if you can tell, like I'm already running out of breath a little bit, there might be more cuts than usual in this video just because I am still recovering. It might be a little bit quieter than normal. I apologize. It's the best that I can do for now. This will get better as the tournament goes along. But without further ado, let's jump right into the review, the analysis of the action. And we're going to start with day number 1. This was a series that I think a lot of people were actually very interested to see. I don't see this as a very interesting matchup on paper. I don't see these two teams as particularly close in terms of skill level. It's the number 1 seed from the LCS in Team Liquid taking on the number 2 seed from the LPL in Top Esports. If anybody has watched this channel over the course of this year, they'll know that I'm really not huge on how the LCS has performed so far in 2024. I don't think that they have actually been as strong as they were in 2023. I think there were a lot of parts of 2023 where it's like this team and this region could compete with like the LEC, per se, in terms of their top tier teams. I think Cloud9 at times in the spring split looked very good. And then you had, of course, Gen.G making quarterfinals, being the only Western team to make quarterfinals at Worlds last year. And so, the LCS performed relatively well the last time they were international. I did not have the same kind of confidence in the region in 2024 so far. I just don't think they've been quite as complete or quite as consistent as maybe they were last year. I still think they have some talent, which is why I don't think they're going to get rolled over really in any series, but I wouldn't expect them to be able to compete with a team like Top Esports. They're going to be pretty heavy favorites here. I actually put Top Esports as my number 3 team at this tournament. I put them above T1. I know people weren't super excited about that in the primer video. That certainly isn't the most popular opinion in the world. I just think people are sleeping on Top Esports rather than being too hyped on T1 at the current moment. I think this is a very good TES team. Now, probably worth noting, they weren't quite as dominant as T1 was in their play-in run. They had to take on Fnatic on their side of the bracket, and Fnatic actually gave them a bit of trouble, especially in the mid lane. I'm not sure how that's going to translate into the main stage. I'm not sure if that's something that we're going to have to keep monitoring, but this series in particular should honestly be easier for them than Fnatic. Fnatic is one of those teams that likes to play fast and aggressive and really likes to push the tempo, and it's going to go for a lot of these 50-50 plays, especially early on in games, and that's just not who Team Liquid is. Liquid is good early on, mostly because they have a couple of very good laners. Impact was really good in lane domestically so far this year. Yan and Core were by far the best bot lane domestically in North America, but mid-jungle, I think, is somewhere where I think Team Liquid could get very exposed, and Tian and Cream are kind of the quote-unquote weakness of Top Esports, and even then, I still feel like they are going to be a strength for the team in this series. So I would expect TES to be better if Liquid ends up taking a game. Maybe I wouldn't be entirely surprised, but I don't expect this series to be all that close. But the only way we're going to know how this series ends up going is going game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Top Esports, they are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. And they looked super good here. This was pretty much exactly what you wanted to see. A very controlled, very strong, like, macro game from them. They knew their win condition. They got a pretty strong draft, a couple of champions that I think their players play at a pretty high level, and they knew what to take away from Team Liquid. Taliyah, Ziggs, Aurelion, Sol. They knew the scouting report. They clearly did their homework on what APA plays in the mid lane here, because they knew exactly what they needed to take away in order to put him on something that he is just less comfortable on. Not that he's horrible on Tristana or anything like that. He has been somebody who's had a wider champion pool at lower levels in the past, but at least at the LCS level, he's definitely more so been known for his artillery gameplay, things like the Ziggs, things like the Aurelion Sol, these team fighters, champions that don't necessarily need to establish early leads because his laning isn't all that good, even domestically, champions that don't need to establish early advantages in order to be useful in the late game. It's kind of the opposite with what they ended up drafting. They ended up going the LPL comp of the Maokai plus Tristana, something I've really advocated for over the course of this tournament, even before this tournament, going back to the LPL playoffs. I was really high on this mid-jungle duo. The problem is you do need to be a good mid-jungle duo in order to pull it off, and especially you need to be able to play through Tristana. You need to be able to play through mid early in order to pull this off, and that just wasn't going to happen for Team Liquid. For Top Esports, they did a lot of things right here. Player of the game for me is going to go to JackeyLove. I think you could realistically give this to either JackeyLove or Mako. I think the Lucian Nami was clearly the most important part of this team, but the Urgot was also very valuable here on R5. This champion's gotten a lot more play at this tournament than I was anticipating. I really didn't expect to see it be this ginormous pick that a lot of teams were going to go towards, but it kind of has been more meta-defining than I was anticipating. Of course, FlyQuest being the big team to pull it out in the play-in stage multiple times, Whippo being a big player of Urgot, but 369 still played it really well in this game, and honestly, he was impossible to deal with in the late game. Basically, all the negative plays surrounding Urgot happened early on, and they just didn't really have any sort of bounce-back plans from them, but Jackie and Mako were just dominant. Jackie absorbing 3 ADC bans early on in the draft, the Draven, the Senna, the Varus, probably his 3 most played over the course of this year, I would imagine, but leaving up JackeyLove's Lucian, not exactly the smartest thing in the entire world. He can still punish you really heavily in the mid game, and if you want an AD carry that's guaranteed to play Lucian like the assassin that he kind of has become, that's going to be JackeyLove. We even saw that in this game around Baron Pit with him just flanking the entirety of Team Liquid by himself on the Lucian and picking up a double kill. It's just kind of insane what he can do on this champion if he's allowed to get ahead, and he dominated the laning phase. Mako's obviously a big part of that. He was landing bubbles like it was, point and click. It was ridiculously easy for him. He was always in the right position. He was just there to keep his AD carry alive in a lot of those fights. Mako very, very well could have been player of the game here if you really want to flip it in that direction. I think it should go to one of these two, but it could go to either. Like I said, 369 was good. Tion was very good on the Sejuani. I was worried about this pick in draft because you don't really have any melee champions to be able to follow up on it, but Tion played Sejuani basically perfectly, especially after like 5 to 10 minutes into the game. It was a near perfect one from Tion in terms of controlling macro and in terms of controlling objectives and making sure he was first to a lot of fights. It was everything you could have asked out of him, a very clean game. And then Kareem was amazing, especially in the 1v1 in lanes. Some of those Hui engages were actually super solid from him, a really nice bounce back from the previous series that he had against Humanoid where he really wasn't all that great. So Top Esports looking very good here, and Team Liquid just kind of looking outclassed. There's really not a lot of other ways to put it. Done of the game for me is going to go to Jan in the bot lane. It really did feel like his mechanics and his decision-making were not good enough in this one, which is unfortunate because Jan was such a positive for Team Liquid domestically. He's a big reason why this team is here, if not the biggest reason why this team is here at this tournament as the LCS champions, is because Jan was really, really good in the playoffs, and that did not carry over. His laning wasn't nearly as good here on the Kalista, wasn't able to keep pressure going into the mid game, and he made some real questionable plays. I mean, going and trying to 1v1 Urgot only to have to flash out and get saved by his support. Don't really know what was going on there. Some of the team fights he was in were really, really poor. He even was gifted a couple of kills throughout this game, and he still couldn't really do a whole ton with them. Just not a great game from Jan. Definitely something you need to see him be better at. And to that same vein, Impact was also pretty horrible this game. He's not going to get the same kind of flame that APA and Jan will because they're a little bit less beloved by the community, but Impact was horrible in this game. He played Cassante really poorly. The 1v1s on the top side did not go his way, and his team fighting, some of the worst Cassante team fighting I have seen from anybody all year long. Truly a bad game from Impact. And Impact and Jan, like we said, were the two best players on Team Liquid domestically in the regular season and in the playoffs. So to see them struggle here, not good. Umti kind of reverting to LCK. Umti here having to go up against good competition. Again, he's just not the kind of player who can get away with his mediocre early games. APA was just not nearly good enough to be playing Tristana at this level, and Core could only do so much on the Renata, right? This was just not a great game for Team Liquid overall. They looked outclassed. Obviously, you don't want to go down 2-0 to a team like Top Esports, but It wasn't a big upset to see TES win game number 1. It wouldn't be a big upset to see TES win game number 2. Can they do that, or is Liquid going to be able to tie up the series, though? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They are going to go up in this series 2-0, and this is a pretty dominant situation for them at this point. They dominated game 1. They really were in control of that all the way through. Game 2, a little bit more even, I would say, through the first, 10 minutes, but then after that, things just rolled out of control for TL to the point where it just was non-recoverable. This was a 20k gold deficit at 20 minutes here as this game ended, and that's a disaster. If you're Team Liquid, you have looked pretty incapable of even keeping up in this series up until this point, even when things are going relatively okay for you in the early game, when you're getting trades, in top lane trades, when you are, getting the Aurelion Sol some kills early on in the game. It just, none of that really seems to matter for you. It seems to be a situation where if you're not in an overwhelmingly positive state, you're going to be losing on the margins because Top Esports is such a good macro team no matter what, and you're just not really able to recover from that. So definitely a very disappointing showing. We'll get into some of the specifics as we continue to go along here with game 2, but for TES, again, it's just across the board. You can point out some mistakes. Maybe 369 was a little bit too aggro in this game. Maybe he did show a little bit too little respect towards NA and gave them, some things that they probably shouldn't have gotten, but that is such a minor criticism of the early game. Everything else was essentially perfect here from TES. It was all 5 members looking excellent, especially in the late game. Player of the game for me is going to go to Cream. In the mid lane, I felt like he was probably the most influential player in this game. In the back half on the Corki, those rockets, man, they were doing a million damage. I understand that Corki's not my favorite champion in the world. I continue to say that Corki is really overrated as a champion and overplayed as a pick in comparison to maybe some of these other late game carries, even things like Aurelion Sol on the other side of this matchup. But when you're just better, when you are very talented, you're going to be able to take over these fights regardless of what champion you're on. And Cream really getting to show some of his mechanical differences in this game, the hands difference, if you will, which he definitely had here. Tian was brilliant in the early game, constantly countering kind of the aggressive plays that Team Liquid wanted to go for, specifically on the top side of the map. He was very active in shutting down Impact on the Rumble, which we will definitely get to, and then diving the Smolder over and over and over again in this game to really not allow Yan to ever be in a position where he could even play from neutral. Tian was excellent. If Tian and Cream were the biggest question marks for TES going into this series, to have the first 2 games go like this, for them to both be so good through the beginning of this series, it's a very good sign. Jackie Love goes deathless on Senna. He just plays so aggro on this champion. He facilitates so much fun gameplay, I would say, for Top Esports just across the board, because he allows everybody else on the team to play even more aggro, and Mako got to play Ornn, which is always a very fun sign. Like I said, 369, maybe not perfect in this game on the TF. I think he would have been punished a bit more if he were playing a team that was better, but he wasn't, so he could get away with some of the things that he was doing. It was just a good game from TES, and especially after 10 minutes, they really snowballed this game out of control. And then for Liquid on the other side, they're just not good enough. The things that they won with domestically in the LCS, they're just not working at an international level. They go for their double dragon comp that they were kind of famous for, the Aurelion Sol plus the Smolder. They played a ton of this in the playoffs because APA is definitely more of a team fighter, somebody who likes to scale into the late game, and Yan honestly got away with playing Smolder because he is such a good laner domestically. He is so good in the 2v2 that he could play Smolder, still go even or even win in lane against other really good bot lanes, and then have the power of Smolder in team fights where he is kind of at his weakest as a player, and that's just not going to work here internationally. That adding on to the fact that Impact almost had double-digit deaths in this game, and he's going to get dead of the game, it's just not a good sign. Impact not really surviving laning phase at all. Impact has been somebody who has been a bit more questionable, at least so far at the start of this series. He has not been good for Liquid. I know a lot of people really like him, and I'm a fan of Impact as well. It's hard not to like him if you've been following the LCS for a long time, but it has not been a good start to the series for him. Umti looks very outclassed in terms of pathing, even if he wasn't really all that awful in this game. And there were moments where it was APA versus the world. He was able to get a couple of kills early on the Aurelion Sol, but then you watch some of those late game team fights, and that's supposed to be his bread and butter, and he's missing Aurelion Sol ultimate, and he's not doing damage, and he's getting 1v1 by Mako's Ornn. It's just bad. It's not, there's nothing good to really be able to say There's really not a lot of good to take away from this so far for Liquid. Their bot lane not being able to win lane is catastrophically bad for them. Impact getting absolutely demolished in lane is catastrophically bad for them. You know, it's not like Umti and APA are going to be able to salvage this team. It just doesn't feel like they are good enough to be able to hang in a series like this, which it is what it is. You're not going to freak out over it, but it's certainly not what you would have wanted to see if you were an NA fan. For Top Esports, this is exactly how you would have wanted to start this series. Play-ins weren't exactly perfect for you. You probably would have wanted to look a bit more dominant against teams like Fnatic. So to have this series here against Team Liquid, to be up 2-0, to potentially go into this Game 3 and complete this sweep in record time, quite frankly, that would be pretty big for TES. Can Liquid even take a game? That's going to be the question here as we move into game number 3. Can Liquid push us to a game 4? Can they keep this series alive, or is TES going to capitalize on the domination that they've shown so far and end this in a sweep? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take this series in a 3-0 sweep, and this was not close. This was never close. It was never going to be close. This was just a blowout between a team that is significantly better than the one they are playing against, and really that is the takeaway here, is that Top Esports is significantly better than Team Liquid. They are not even remotely in the same stratosphere. I believe NA is now, what, like 2-39 or something against LPL and LCK teams over the last 2 years or something like that. It's some ridiculous stat that's just completely incomprehensible, but it's just not good enough. I mean, there's really nothing else to say. The LCS is not on the level where they can compete with one of the best teams in the LPL right now. They are just not there. They're not close to being there. This was another demolition. This was 3 straight games of Top Esports being significantly better than their opposition. And congratulations to them. They're moving on to the semifinals now, the upper bracket semifinals, which is where they should be. This isn't a big upset or anything. It was a good draw for them, I think, all things considered, but you're not going to be surprised by this outcome really at all. Player of the game and player of the series for me as a whole is going to go to Tion in the jungle. I think people were talking about how Tion's consistency wasn't exactly always there. That really didn't show up on film, I would say, over the course of this year. I think when you take a look at how he actually performed in 2024 and disregard some of his reputation and some of the plays that he's made in previous years, he's actually been really good this year. He's been, for the most part, a major asset to Top Esports and one of their best players. I think over the course of the entirety of the year, I would make the argument he was their 3rd or 4th best player in the regular season. 369 and Mako probably the big carries in the regular season. Jaculov obviously stepping it up in the playoffs, but Tion has been excellent for this team. He really has been a pace setter. He's been someone this team can actually rely on in a lot of pivotal situations. So, you know, to see him step up here and just be better than Umti, that's not a shock. That's not a surprise. I had Umti as like my 10th best jungler at the tournament. He was below some play-in junglers. Like, I just don't trust Umti. I really have never trusted Umti, and he did nothing to dissuade those thoughts here. He was horrible in game number 3, which we will definitely talk about. But Tion continuing to put a lot of pressure onto oppositions, having really good early games, and specifically having very strong mid games to be able to really capitalize on the great opportunities he's able to set up for the rest of his team. I think you could realistically give player of the series to Jaculov as well. He was the other player I was considering, maybe even Cream. Cream was excellent in terms of the damage he was able to output here on Corki. It felt like every single fight he had one major package after another in terms of what he was offering on that champion. I know it's a bit of a meme in the LPL community that he's not the best Corki in the world. Well, he certainly played like one of the best Corkis in the world, at least in this performance. I guess that goes to show where Team Liquid is at, but man, Cream looked excellent in this series. Jaculov was amazing on the Lucian, specifically here in game number 3. He just plays it so aggro. He's constantly pushed up. You really like Lucian Milio. I understand taking the Nami away on R2. I understand being like, we don't want to give that over for free if we don't have to, but I don't really know if it put you in the best of spots having to pick something like Jhin, and so Jaculov gets to play Lucian. He still gets to be super aggro, and honestly, he maybe even gets a better bot lane partner in the Milio to be able to give him extra range in some of these fights, which is really at times some of the only things Lucian is missing. So you gotta love Jaculov. Mako was excellent. I think Broadcast gave Mako player of the series. I wasn't considering Mako. I think that's probably a little bit overselling of what he did, but it was still fine. 369 was definitely good here. He was the one player that I think was at least attempted to be capitalized on by Team Liquid throughout this series. Not that it was always successful, but he was the one that they were looking at because he was pushed up a little farther forward than his other team members. But Top Esports was just amazing across the board. It wasn't close across the board. This was not a difficult series for them at all. And then for Team Liquid, they just were never in this series really at any point. Like, it was never even remotely going to be close. Everybody felt outclassed. Jan is going to get done of the game once again in Game 3. I don't think this was quite as clear-cut because I think everybody on Team Liquid was really horrible here in Game 3, but I think the big problem is that Jan was so integral and so important towards what Team Liquid did domestically, towards getting that #1 seed, towards winning the LCS. Like, his ability to win lane and dominate early in games was truly instrumental towards Team Liquid's playstyle. It was probably the most important thing that they had going into a tournament like this, and it just was not, it was not here today. He was horrible, horrible, horrible in this series. He was 2 versus 0ing in lane and was still losing in CS to Jackie Love. I mean, it was just about as bad as it gets. Core wasn't much better, getting caught out randomly on the Nami, being pushed way too far forward. In some of these fights, just a couple of really awful circumstances. was miserable in Game 3, easily his worst game of the series so far, in my opinion. I say so far, but this was it, right? Umti's worst game of the series here in Game 3. He was not good. Tian jungled circles around him. Impact was a disaster in Games 1 and 2. I think he was slightly better in Game 3, if only because he was looking for flank angles, and Renekton generally offers just a bit more stability in the early game, but it wasn't a ton better in APA. Like, he wasn't making the same kind of egregious errors that his teammates were making on his Aurelion Sol, but he also wasn't making good plays, and he was missing ultimates, and he wasn't dealing maximum damage, and he was playing way too safe. Like, it just wasn't a good series for TL. They felt entirely outclassed. It didn't feel like they were ever remotely going to be in a series like this, and that's really the only takeaway you have, is that Team Liquid now going down into the lower bracket. Reminder, they're not eliminated. They're not out of MSI for losing the first series. It is double elimination here at MSI, and so they go down into the lower bracket. They've got a lot to figure out. This is a team that I think very likely is looking to be kind of a no-wins kind of team at MSI. I think NA as a region is really kind of being prepped to not do super well at MSI this year, and if that's going to be the case, that's going to be the case. I think we sent 2 teams that were not exactly the peak in terms of mechanics that the region has to offer, because I don't think the region has really been able to figure its shit out over the course of this year so far, and I think, unfortunately, this is just going to be the consequence of that. When you have a team that relies so much on being able to just outplay their opponents, and they're not going to be able to do that against LPL teams, yeah, you're going to get worse outcomes, and that's what happened here. And then for TES, their macro is just so far advanced from a lot of other teams at this tournament. I definitely got some pushback for putting them at number 3. I don't think beating Team Liquid is going to solidify that spot for a lot of people, especially with how play-ins went for them when they weren't quite as dominant, but I still think this can be one of the 3 best teams in the world, and I still think that there is a lot to like about what they showed here. Tian, Cream, Jackie Love, Mako, even 369, all of them looked really good, and all of them did the things they were supposed to do. They weren't overreaching, they weren't over-aggressive, they took what the enemy team gave them, they spiraled it out of control, and they won games in 20 to 25 minutes. It's exactly what you want to see from a TES team that should be winning games pretty heftily in this circumstance. So credit to them. They were excellent in this series, and I'm really excited to see what they do in round number 2. But then moving on to our second series, our day 2. Of course, we're covering both day 1 and day 2 in this video just because of the way the schedule worked out. So moving on to day number 2, we've got a series that should theoretically be at least a bit closer. One I'm not expecting to be a ton closer, but maybe not quite as much of a blowout. It's the number 1 seed from the LCK in Gen.G taking on the number 2 seed from the LEC in Fnatic. Certainly not a matchup where I would expect the outcome to be up in the air. I think Gen.G are favorites in this one for a reason, but I don't think it's quite top Esports versus Team Liquid, where I would have been shocked if Liquid won a game. Even going into the series, I think matchup-wise, they just matched up super poorly into a team like TES. I think Fnatic has some more interesting ways to win games. I think they're obviously way more aggressive than a team like Team Liquid is in terms of their playstyle, and they do kind of have the hands to be able to match in a perfect scenario if both Razork and Humanoid are playing at a high level. And so I'm not going to sit here and write them out and say that it's impossible for them to win a game, but Gen.G should have no trouble in this series. We've talked about Gen.G pretty extensively already in the primer. They have the best player in the world at the current moment in Chovy. That's not even really all that debatable in terms of how things have gone so far in 2024. He has just been the best player in the world at every single step of the process. He was by far the best player in the regular season. He was by far the best player in the LCK playoffs. There really just has not been a moment where Chovy has not been able to completely outplay everybody that he's gone up against, including Faker and, every other mid laner in the LCK. So I think when you have a player like that, you're going to be favored in basically every series, but it's not just Chovy. That's what makes Gen.G so scary. Canyon is here too, and Canyon's having the best year he's had in 3 years, in my opinion. I mean, you have Keen, who just won Finals MVP in the LCK and is having a phenomenal year himself. You have Pays and Lehens, who, while they certainly haven't been perfect, Lehens has been pretty darn good. Pays has definitely been more of a question mark, and I think you could make an argument it's maybe even the biggest question mark of anybody on any of the top, like, 4 teams at this tournament. I think that's a realistic thing to say with how he has played so far this year, but when you have Canyon and Chovy, who are the best mid-jungle duo in the world by far, when you have Keen, who's got an argument to be the best top laner in the world right now, and even Lehens, who's got an argument to be the best support, or at least in the conversation to be the best support, like, this team should not have any trouble with a team like Fnatic that's just gonna be scrappy, right? Like, that's what you're looking for Fnatic to do, is try their best. So we'll see what ends up happening, but of course, going game by game means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and this was a pretty big, I would say, encapsulation of what I expected this series to be, of the exact types of games that I think we're going to be getting out of this series. Fnatic really did try to stay close for a little while. The first 10 to 15 minutes of this game, pretty even. Maybe not like perfectly even, like Gen.G was getting a 2 or a 3k gold lead, but Fnatic was staying alive. They were making good plays. Humanoid was staying active on the map. Jun was doing a good job on the Ashe of actually being proactive, and they were trying to set up opportunities for Noah to get involved in some of these plays, even if he was like way too over-aggressive in some of these fights. But macro just ends up being Fnatic's downfall. You get to the 15 to 20 minute mark, you make one major mistake with Razork, getting caught out right before Dragon in the middle of the mid lane, and all of a sudden the game is over, right? Gen.G can take that small mistake and snowball it into the gigantic lead that they were able to end the game with. It's just kind of the way that Gen.G plays. They are the most tactical team in the entire world, the most clean team in the entire world, and we saw that here. Player of the game for me in game number 1 is going to go to Keen in the top lane. I don't think a lot of people are going to give this to Keen, but you cannot give him Keen Sante. Like, it's just not really particularly fair. I understand that Fnatic wanted to leave it up because they probably wanted Oscar to play it. It's been Oscar's best champion as a pro ever since he was promoted to the main roster of Fnatic, but Keen is not the same as 369. Like, I love 369. 369's a good K'Sante player. He's better at other champions. It's not necessarily what I would consider him a master at. Keen is a K'Sante master. Like, Keen Sante is a meme in the LCK community for a reason. Oscar can't leave up K'Sante and then be like, I can R5 Camille like I did earlier this tournament and expect to survive in the same kind of way. It didn't happen. Keen was a menace in this game, constantly landing knockbacks in perfect situations, making life living hell for Oscar in lane, and then basically everybody out of lane. Like, this was a dominant K'Sante performance. Really good stuff from Keen. Chovy was also excellent here on the Corki, just a billion damage. He made one mistake down in the bot lane earlier on in the game. He got caught out in a fight. He realized he didn't have to blow sums, and, you know, he ends up dying, and after that point, he's like, well, that was my one death of the game, and now I'm gonna play perfect from here on out, and that's exactly what he ended up doing. I thought Lehens was excellent here on the Rumble. Rumble's one of those supports that I think is really going to separate, like, the 4 best supports at this tournament from everybody else. Like, the best supports playing Rumble are going to absolutely decimate on this champion. That would be my prediction, is that this champion's going to look ridiculously broken in the hands of the best supports in the game, and he's going to look not that good in the hands of, like, Western teams or anybody else, really. Like, that's what I would anticipate. Kind of what we saw here. Some perfect ultimates coming out from Lehens, specifically around those dragon fights, like, just really, really well-timed and well-placed Rumble ults that are really able to kind of change the game up. Just good stuff overall from Gen.G. Pays could have been a bit more, I guess, clean in this game in terms of some of the positioning. Canyon, I think, was pretty good. Overall, Gen.G maybe could have had the gas pedal a little bit heavier in the early part of the game, but this is Gen.G. They're going to give over advantages early on so that they can get advantages late game, because they don't want to give over advantages on the other side. Like, that's just kind of who they are. They're not going to play super fast. They're not going to play super aggro. They're going to beat you through their macro, and that's exactly what they did here, taking advantage of one massive mistake. But we'll talk about that for Fnatic. Dud of the game is unfortunately going to go to Razork. He made a couple of mistakes down the stretch of this game that I think really cost his team. Wukong was just kind of a pick where you needed to be a lot more useful in some of these fights, especially around these dragons, man. You can't be getting caught out in the mid lane. You can't be getting caught out in these weird situations. I remember even at the end of the game, he's like covering top lane at half health and just gets one shot by Keen, and it's like, what are you doing? Like, why are you there? What is the purpose? Like, what was the thought process behind it? This was not a particularly great game from Razork, and like we said, he was one of the 2 players that I think really needed to step up for Fnatic if they wanted to be able to compete in a series like this, and it very much did not happen here in game number 1. I think Humanoid also had a couple of really bad plays in this game on the Taliyah. I think he had basically this team's only good plays this game on the Taliyah, but you're going to have to take the good with the bad when it comes to him. He had some positioning errors that were just egregious, and Chovy was certainly better than him when it came to, like, the mid game, and that was very clear. which really shouldn't be happening, by the way, on Taliyah versus Corki. Taliyah should be controlling that matchup super easily. Noah was being really aggressive for absolutely no reason, was flashing in to just do a bit of extra damage, not even to secure kills. Just a very weird game. I don't think Noah played well. I don't think Oscar played all that well. He kind of got destroyed by Keen on the top side. I kind of talked about it. It was a little bit of hubris to allow Keen to just pick K'Sante and to be like, yeah, we can counter it with Oscar's Camille and just expect to be able to win that. You're not going to be able to win that. Like, you're not talented enough mechanically to be able to win that. So that was a bit of an issue. Jun was just whatever this game on the Ashe. I don't think he was the problem. He has been Fnatic's best player for the past month and a half, 2 months, whatever you really want to say. The playoffs of the LEC and then obviously the play-in stage so far, he has been the best player on Fnatic. So, you know, kind of continuing that here with the Ashe because he certainly wasn't the problem. But again, Fnatic just feel a bit outclassed. Even if they are going to be able to compete in the early game, if they are going to be able to make some aggressive plays and to try to stay even through a lot of the early games here, they just don't have the firepower to actually be able to keep up once these games go later. Gen.G's macro is significantly better and their team fighting is just significantly better. Fnatic makes mistakes and Gen.G's not the kind of team that's going to let those mistakes go unpunished. And so I think this game one was a pretty good encapsulation of what my expectations for this series were. Can Fnatic bounce back in game two though? Can they show something a bit more interesting in the early parts of this game that can actually translate into the mid to late? Or is Gen.G going to very similarly just be able to strangle them out of every single piece of resource that they have on the map? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0. And kind of a really interesting game to talk about here. This went 44 minutes. It really had no business going that long. I think there was really only one player on Gen.G that wanted this game to go any longer than it was going, and that was Canyon, which we will definitely get to. But this was an okay game for Fnatic. I'm not going to sit here and say it was a good game for them. There were a couple of fights that I think really went their way. There were a couple of times where it was like, you know, good job. You're fighting back. You're doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're keeping things close. You're keeping things interesting. But I certainly think they could have been a bit more clinical in terms of their execution in some of these fights. And it never really felt like Gen.G was out of control. Like, Fnatic was getting small leads here or there. They were actually winning some fights towards the back half of these games, or just towards the back half of this game. In particular, they were winning at times in some of these fights. They just weren't actually able to get any sort of concrete leads from it because they never had the map pressure to be able to translate it into anything. And that's where Gen.G just has to be given a lot of credit. Even when they're losing fights, even when they're not playing as clean as maybe they should be, as, you know, kind of they would be expected to be as the team that they are, they're still able to hold on to 7, 8K gold leads throughout the entirety of this game. So credit to Gen.G. We'll talk about it now. Player of the game is once again for me going to go to Keen in the top lane. I think he's being slept on with how good he has been so far in this series. I know K'Sante is kind of a champion that everybody loves to complain about, but you still have to play K'Sante at a high level. We've seen this champion underperform. Even at this tournament, even on this patch, we've seen this champion just kind of be mediocre, just be a guy in some of these team comps. He was not a guy in this game. He is constantly creating pressure, and you know, you can look at some of these scorelines. You can maybe look at the Draven and say that the gold lead that he was able to generate was super instrumental in keeping Gen.G in this game, or that Lehens on the Nami was essentially perfect in terms of being able to set up some of these later fights, or even that Chovy on the Aurelion Sol doing 64,000 damage in this game was the driving force for why Gen.G was able to win it. But to me, when you go and watch these team fights, when you go and watch like the game-winning plays for Gen.G, who is my eye drawn to in almost all of them? Keen, the K'Sante, diving onto the backline, making life a lot more difficult for Humanoid, making life a lot more difficult for Noah, just generally making things more difficult for Fnatic to be able to win any of these fights. And I think Keen really has played great in this series up until this point, so I want to give him his props. Again, Chovy, Pays, Lehens, all of them also have arguments, I think, for player of the game. Chovy did the most damage by far, was really carrying some of these late fights on Aurelion Sol. He is hyper consistent in that stage of the game, and he also could have potentially done more. I don't want to go into whatever the ultimate bug was, whether it was spectator bug, whether the game should have been paused or whatever. I don't really know what happened here in game 2. Chovy drops an ultimate on a couple of members. Nobody gets knocked up. It just kind of dissipates into nothing. I don't really know, again, if that's some people are saying it's spectator bug guaranteed because the damage went off, but I didn't see the knockup go off, which would have certainly changed quite a bit. I don't know. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I know what happened. Chovy might have had even more of an impact on the game if that had actually worked, but Pays probably had his best game in a while here on the Draven, was able to get a cash out very early on and was able to snowball that into being very relevant in a lot of fights. Fnatic really had no way of getting on him in team fights, and Lehens was great at being able to peel people off of both the Aurelion and the Draven, keeping things alive, and also he was great at being an aggressor in the mid game as well. So a lot of credit to 4 of the 5 members of Gen.G, but Dud of the Game is actually going to very rarely stay on the winning side here, and that's going to go to Canyon. He was awful in this game. I mean, truly atrocious. He did not want to win this. Like, there was no universe in which Canyon wanted to win this game. I know he pulled out the Kazakhs in the LCK finals. We talked about it on this channel. I was like, you know, I can believe that. He likes it as a counter pick into Xin Zhao. I understand the idea of why you would want to go something like Kazakhs, and at the beginning of this game, it was working. He was able to pick up that first blood onto Humanoid, just Q-evolved right in the face of Razork, just completely ignoring his damage, completely like a Chad. And then he goes bot lane, picks up another kill, and it's like, wow, this Kazakhs pick is actually working. And then the later this game goes, the more and more Canyon's just getting caught out, not being useful in fights, not getting any isolated kind of bonuses on anybody because Fnatic's playing around the champion well. Like, what was this champ supposed to do in the back half of this game? I don't really know, and Canyon even played it bad in that circumstance. I truly do believe Canyon was the worst player in this game, which is why he's getting Dud of the Game. Again, very rare for me to give Dud of the Game to anybody who wins the game, just because it's not typically how it works, but I think Canyon was the most detrimental player to his own team. He is, quite frankly, the only reason this game went 44 minutes, and I say that with respect towards Fnatic. If Canyon had played like a human being in this one, this would have been a 25, 30-minute game. Like, there's just no excuse. So, credit to Gen.G. 4 of the 5 members of this team played really well, and, you know, Canyon did his best to lose it, but the Kazakhs couldn't quite drag them down enough. For Fnatic on the other side, Noah was really good here. I think some of the Lucian fights were clutch, and Jun, I think, continues to be a positive. I wish he was on something that had a bit more playmaking potential than the Milio, because he has been, you know, kind of the best player on this team, and you want to give him something he can be more active on, but the rest of this team was just kind of okay. Oscar had a couple of good fights here on the Poppy, but was generally worse than his counterpart on the other side. Razork had a couple of good fights on the Xin Zhao, but again, lost pressure early and didn't really have a mid-game at all on the Xin, which is never a good thing. And Humanoid kind of the same, right? Like, bad early game, basically non-existent, was constantly, you know, backing in bad positions, not respecting his opponent, and then eventually finally started to play well as this game went longer and longer. It's good that he had those good moments, but I think the fact that there wasn't any sort of consistency throughout the entire game really led me to believe that nobody played fantastic for Fnatic. Everybody just kind of had moments of being very good. Noah and June, I think, were the closest to that. I think the Lucian definitely continues to work, basically for everybody who's played it at this tournament, but again, even with like a lot going their way, even with Gen.G's jungler just trying to throw the game at Fnatic, they still weren't actually able to win the fights. At the end of the game, they were able to win some of the later game fights, but it just isn't enough for them to be able to win. They're constantly down 6K gold when all things are said and done, and I know a lot of that's Draven, but you still need to be able to account for that, and they had no way of dealing with that. So, you know, Fnatic looking better than, you know, what we saw out of Team Liquid in the first series, but this is still looking like Gen.G is in full control, and now you're going into Game 3, and you've already seen, like, one of the low rolls of what you can expect from a team like Gen.G. If they get anywhere close to what they were in the LCK finals in Game 3, this is not going to be a close series. This is going to be a sweep. But can Fnatic build upon a relatively decent game number 2, a game number 2 that was at least kind of close, or is Gen.G going to close the door, say that Game 2 was just them kind of messing around, and really show that this is one of the best teams in the entire world? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to take this series in another 3-0 sweep. And we get to talk about 2 sweeps in today's video. This isn't a surprise in the same way that the first one wasn't a surprise. That Top Esports destroying Team Liquid wasn't shocking. It's not shocking that Gen.G was able to destroy Fnatic. This is kind of what we expected to happen in a series like this. These are the teams that should be moving on very cleanly into the next round. Very similarly to what we said about TL, Fnatic fans, don't worry. You're not out of the tournament just yet. In fact, you're going into the lower bracket to take on Team Liquid, who looked way worse in their first round series than you did. You had a lot of the play-in experience, and so there's reason to believe Fnatic could potentially be doing better as things continue to move on, because they did play well at times in this series. They just didn't have the firepower, or quite frankly, the mechanics to be able to go toe-to-toe with a team like Gen.G, and not a lot of teams in the world do, and so it's not really a big bar that it's like, how dare they not be able to cross. For Gen.G, this was pretty good from them. Maybe you wanted to see them be a little bit more stable. Like, they were quite aggressive in this game. This was almost against some of their kind of team ideology in terms of their consistency, in terms of being able to play out games very cleanly into the late game. Like, we kind of saw what they wanted to do in game 1, and then they slowly started to abandon that in favor of just playing a little bit wackier as this series went on, and it still ended up working because mechanically they are just better than Fnatic, but I don't know if that's the kind of style that's going to work against the other best teams in the world. I think maybe this was just something they wanted to see if they could get out of here against EU with, and they clearly were able to do it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Chovy in the mid lane here for game 3. He was awesome this whole series. I know Choki is such a fun narrative to throw out because he's never been to an international final, and that's a pretty big problem. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say that I don't understand why people have that narrative with him, but I think context matters in a lot of those situations. If he was a player that had pretty, regularly underperformed individually at international events, then I would say, he's got a reputation. Like, there are players like that out there that have reputations of underperforming internationally that have kind of earned it because they themselves, play worse. But Chovy, honestly, has played fine internationally over the course of his career. He has been good. He's just not been on teams that are good enough, or at least has not gotten the luck, right? Like, there were a couple of times where it looked like it was going to be possible. It just never became a reality for him. Last year was probably his best opportunity up until that point in his career, and it just quite wasn't there for him. Of course, people are going to look at him getting to the semifinals of Worlds in 2022 and say that should have been a finals appearance, but they lost to DRX, who won Worlds, and so how much are you really going to freak out over that? There are certainly some things, but Chovy was excellent in this series. I expect him to continue to be excellent throughout MSI, but player of the series as a whole for me is going to go to Keen in the top lane. I know this Vayne game wasn't exactly the most, wow, he dominated, but I think games 1 and 2 were more than enough for me to give him player of this series as a whole. I just think he was the most valuable player in the first half of this series for Gen.G when the games were the hardest. I know people are going to look at how Humanoid played this game and the amount of gold he was able to generate and say, okay, well, game 3 was also very difficult for Gen.G to win, but Humanoid was kind of throwing away a lot of those advantages as we went further and further along into this game. And, I'm not going to sit here and say game 3 was the hardest to win for Gen.G. I think Keen, when it mattered the most in the first couple of games of this series on Cassante, really showed why that champion is basically permabanned against him or taken away from him in the LCK. You cannot really allow him to have it. And I think across all 3 games, he was the highest performing member for me. I think Pays and Lahens were really good this series. I think they're going to get underrated by the community as a whole because there is a bit of a reputation kind of surrounding them with how they played towards the back half of the season, and that just carries over, I would say, into some of these performances, but they were good here today, even if Noah and June definitely did some interesting things here, and Canyon tried his best to throw away game 2, but outside of that, he was fine in this series. I'm certainly not going to criticize him too heavily. He wanted to play Kha'Zix. I understand. It's the international stage. You want to do something fun against an EU team. I get it. But overall, Gen.G, again, kind of going away from some of their more controlled chaos style and just kind of going to chaos, and that's certainly not what I want to see from them moving forward. Hopefully, they can rein it in a bit, but for Fnatic, they put up a good effort, certainly better than what Team Liquid put up against Top Esports earlier in this video. Humanoid is going to look pretty good for a lot of this game, being able to get leads on that LeBlanc, doing a good job in the early to mid-game to actually establish pressure for Fnatic, but the problem is that he just did nothing with it as the game continued to go along. He was actually really bad in the late game here, often trading 1-for-1, and as LeBlanc, you just can't really get away with that. I think if he were a bit better, I actually think this game becomes a lot closer for Fnatic, but I think he played some of these last fights really poorly, and I'm not going to criticize him too much, but he was kind of he's going to get a little overhyped, I think, for this series, in my opinion. I think he was just okay. I've seen Humanoid do better than this, and I think he could have done better than this. But dead of the game for me, in game 3 is going to go to Oscar Rinnan. The Scion just isn't working. It hasn't worked basically for anybody all year long. Internationally, anywhere in the world, it's just not really been a pick that has worked all that much in pro, and especially because you're getting counterpicked with the Vayne here in the top lane. Oscar, I know, wants to play these weak side tanks. He wants to be left on an island and not really given a lot of responsibility when these games matter. I don't know, it just doesn't really feel like something I would have gone for here. I think Razork was not great in this series, even with Canyon underperforming. I think Razork needed to be a lot more aggro on the Xin Zhao in the mid game, and oftentimes he was late to a lot of these objectives, which I think really hurt his team overall. Noah and Jun were generally fine. Jun was getting absolutely obliterated at the beginning of every single fight, and Noah couldn't really do anything without any peel on the team, but, again, it's what the comp was. It just kind of is what it is when you're going to draft an Ashe in the support position. It just kind of, you got to live with that. That's the drawback. That's the takeaway there. But for Fnatic, again, they were okay. I don't want to sit here and lambast them or their gameplay. I think they were generally fine, all things considered. Do I think they were perfect? No. Do I think they should be favorites going into their lower bracket series? Probably. We'll talk about that a bit more once we're done with round number 1, when we start to preview some of the lower bracket series, some of the series that are coming up. But for Fnatic, I certainly don't think this should be the end of the optimism for potentially the rest of this MSI run. But for Gen.G, they move on now to round 2. They are going to play top Esports, who we just saw beat Team Liquid, and so definitely an intriguing matchup there. They're going to be favorites for that series, if only because they have Chovy, who is just a monster and should be able to win any series he's in. But if Keen continues to play well, if Pays and Lahens can step it up from what they were domestically, which I think is certainly a possibility, and if Canyon can rein it in and take it a little bit more seriously against an opponent maybe that he cares a little bit more about, then I think Gen.G is still going to be one of the best teams at the tournament. They didn't even play at 100% in this series. This was like 75% of Gen.G, and they still 3-0'd Fnatic in pretty good fashion, especially in the back half of these games. I'm not worried at all about what this team is going to do for the rest of this tournament. All right, but that is going to do it for my MSI Day 1 and Day 2 of the main bracket overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Again, I apologize if you hear a lot of these breaths, these bigger pauses in these videos. I'm still getting over the surgery, and it's just a little bit difficult to get through these videos at full strength. So again, I appreciate you guys' patience. Up on the screen is going to be the updated bracket. Gen.G and Top Esports moving on to round number 2. Fnatic and Team Liquid falling down into the lower bracket. No surprises there. Nothing to really preview other than the matchup for day number 3, which is going to be Bilibili Gaming taking on PSG Talon. Another matchup that isn't really all that up for debate. The one interesting first-round matchup is coming last out of all of these series, but Bilibili should have no trouble with PSG. This should not be a close series in any respect. This should be a 3-0, and it should be a fast 3-0, similar to what we saw out of the 2 series that we got already. I would be more surprised if Bilibili dropped a game than if they absolutely obliterated PSG in all 3. That's really the expectation for what that series should be. But let me know what you guys thought of the 2 series that we already got here in the main stage bracket. Let me know what you think's going to happen tomorrow with the series between Bilibili and PSG. I would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We're covering every single day of MSI, surgery and all on this channel. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of all of the games like we gave here today, hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.